Hello everyone. I'm back today just to wrap up the episodes on the bishop c4, bishop c4, the Fischer-Sozin attack against the Najdorf defense. I did originally intend to make that only one video, but there were just so many lines that I decided in the first episode, the previous one, which I would recommend you check out first if you haven't seen it yet. In that one, I chose to cover from this position after White's sixth move, bishop c4. We have the opening line that we're investigating, and here we're recommending the move e6, which is the most principled reply against bishop c4, closing off the diagonal. And here bishop to b3 is the line that we're going to be examining now. This is by far the main line, so if you do play this in the Najdorf, then expect to encounter the move bishop b3 more often than the alternative tries. Yesterday what we examined is we looked at the move castling immediately instead of bishop b3. We looked at the move a4, and we also looked at this rather dangerous move bishop to e3. So today let's go ahead and begin our study of the main line. Now here against this move, black actually has a variety of choices, but most commonly either bishop to e7 or b5, or the line that I'm going to recommend, which I really like, and I think it has obtained very good results for black, so it's kind of tried and tested. It's the move knight bd7. So the idea is black, delays his natural development one tempo, but he wants to bring his knight to d7 so that he can bring it jump onto c5 in the future and target the b3 bishop, as well as from c5 it would be putting pressure on e4 as well. But its main goal is going to be to try and neutralize this bishop as white maybe progresses in his sort of breaking down of this barrier, shall we say. So here in the position, the main move is f4, but I want to cover also the move castling and the move bishop to g5 as popular alternatives. So let's take a look at that. If white goes ahead and castles, then black can simply continue with his plan of knight to c5, and already putting this double pressure. And here white can do one of two things. He can either defend the e-pawn with a move like rook to e1, or he can actually play a similar idea to what we looked at in the previous video, which is to play f4 and simply ignore the e-pawn, sacrifice it in order to get an assault against the black position as quickly as possible. Let's take a look at the more dangerous of the two first, f4. Well, if f4, black can go ahead and capture on e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and here we see f5, right? So this is similar to what we looked at in a previous line. Although in another line that we saw black actually captured with a bishop that was on b7 already, bishop takes e4, and then grabbed the f5 pawn. Here, of course, grabbing the f5 pawn is not an option because, well, after knight takes f5, then you have your e-file is open and a lot of pressure down on the f7 point. So you want to try and keep things as closed as possible. So the move e5 is best. And here, white doesn't really have time to be, retreating with his knight. So the typical move here is the tactical shot, queen to h5. Basically saying, well, I don't need to defend my knight because I'm threatening checkmate. Next move. So black needs to do something about this and will typically play the move d5 to cut off this diagonal. I will say, however, if you want to do your own kind of further study, in looking at this position, I saw the move Queen D7. It's a recommendation of the computer, but it's not really a move that, at least in my database, has been played often at all. But I don't really see anything too wrong with it, right? The queen goes to a bit of an awkward square for sure. But, you know, black is up a pawn and it's a central pawn, and the white queen here is going to allow the knight to retreat with tempo, you know, because the knight will, if it gets hit, let's say if rook e1, then the knight goes back, right? And then at this point, the queen is being attacked. So the queen's placement is not ideal, and sooner or later the white knight is also going to have to retreat. So that means that there's going to be a couple of tempi that white needs to use, because his pieces are maybe a little bit vulnerable too. And this means that you know, even though black's pieces are a little bit either exposed, like the knight on e4, or awkwardly placed, like the queen on d7, you know, at the end of the day, a pawn is a pawn, and especially a central pawn. And you know, white doesn't have any clear way through. So this is definitely very interesting. Having said that, this isn't how people have played this line over the years. Instead, they play the move d5, which I think is also a good move. And here white continues with his tactics, rook to e1. Now it seems as though the knight would once again be possible to be taken, but this would be a mistake, because again we play on the same theme of the pressure on the f7 point, and we play rook takes e4 with check. And you see that d takes e4 is not an option, because then the bishop would be opened up and it would be checkmate. So e takes d4 would be a kind of a big mistake. And you know, we have this kind of funky position on the board where, you know, each side is actually, like, black could take the knight and white is actually threatening to take the knight next move, and it's a little bit strange. But what black actually does here is he plays the move bishop to c5, taking advantage of this diagonal. Notice as well, we said this in the previous video, you know, and as a general rule, when white does push the f-pawn, we've seen in some lines the white king drops out to h1 just to step away from this diagonal, because you know, this diagonal can be taken advantage of either by the bishop, as we can see here, or sometimes the queen can go from d8 to b6. So bishop to c5 is played, and now white grabs the knight, and of course you cannot recapture like this. You could recapture like this, but you know, black figures in general here in this position that he's in no rush to recapture because of the pin, so he goes ahead and castles. Now, you know, c3 for example would not be good, because now black certainly is threatening, his biggest threat is to capture the rook on e4 now that the f7 point is being covered. So white goes ahead and plays the move rook to g4, and now black captures. The king steps on to h1, and now we see that there is some danger of an attack here. Certainly moves like bishop h6, maybe bishop g5. We see that this bishop is still eyeing, you know, x-raying the black king, and this pawn on f5 can be dangerous in some situations. So we have to, not to mention as well, rook to h4. So certainly, you know, black needs to be a little bit wary of white's possible attacks. So he plays the move e4, which is a nice way of kind of improving communication between black's pieces. Now there's never going to be any rook takes d4 ideas or anything like this, but the most important thing is that the bishop is now covering this square. It should be noted that if white plays a move like rook h4, there's a lot of pressure on the h7 pawn, and of course a move like h6 could be very problematic after bishop takes h6, g takes h6, queen takes h6, and I really wouldn't like to be on the defending side here, because you know, there's simply too many threats. Queen h7 mate and rook g4 with mate as well. Well, actually, I perhaps I'm wrong here, and a move like bishop takes f5 would hold the entire position. But you know, there's no real need to even find out, because if white plays the move rook h4, we actually have a nice tactical move, bishop takes f5, defending the h7 pawn. And the point is that if queen takes f5, then queen takes h4. The rook would be undefended. So the move e4 is very nice. And here white, he can try to continue his attack. You know, we have to remember that white is actually down a pawn, so he needs to try to show that he has compensation for it. One of the options is bishop to h6. Now, after bishop to h6, king to h8, and the rook goes to d1. And we see that this bishop is kind of being harassed. And of course, if you move the bishop, then the pawn on d5 is falling. And if the pawn on d5 falls, then the pawn on e4 will fall. And, you know, there's a lot of problems. So black in general actually plays g takes h6, rook takes d4. And now, you know, black accepts this bad pawn structure. But the point is that after the move queen to f6, the white pawn is under attack, as is the rook on d4. So white basically has no choice but to grab on d5, which is the natural move. And now this position would seem like white is doing great, right? Because look at white's pieces versus black's pieces, and look at black's pawn structure, right? It's not very good at all. But black has a very strong move here. Maybe you can pause the video and see if you see the idea. So the idea is to take advantage of the fact that the white king has some back rank problems down f1. So the move bishop to e6 can be played here. Now the problem is that this rook is under attack, and it cannot really afford to go to these, let's say, vulnerable squares from which it would be vulnerable, and also it would leave the back rank unattended. So rook d1 is white's best move. Now black continues with the back rank ideas, rook a to d8. The bishop cannot be taken because of this issue, and of course rook takes d8, rook takes d8. Still the bishop couldn't be taken because of back rank problems. Now also the pawn on f5 cannot be effectively defended, because if rook f1, then black can actually still take on f5, since at the end of queen takes, bishop takes, the bishop would not be hanging because of, once again, the back rank issues. So after rook a d8, white will typically play maybe rook to e1, queen takes f5, queen takes f5, bishop takes f5, and then rook f4 and bishop to g6, right? And so here we have a position where, on the one hand, you know, white's pawn structure is a little bit better, but the thing about it is that this is basically an extra pawn, right? And we can say that if black didn't have this pawn on h6, the position would be equal anyway, right? Approximately equal. In fact, this pawn actually can be quite a danger, and the existence of the h6 pawn can actually be quite useful for black. It's not even though it may be a doubled pawn and an isolated pawn, it's by far not it's not a dead pawn. For example, you might picture a scenario where black plays f5 just to support his protected passed pawn. And in a situation like this, a lot of the time white will play a move like g4 to try to undermine the base of the pawn, right? But if you have this spare h pawn, then you can bring the h pawn onto h5 and block off these g4 ideas, while at the same time still keeping a h7 pawn, which will keep your bishop defended, and so you have a more solid kingside pawn formation, let's say. So the point is that here, you know, we have a double rooks and bishop endgame, where black is just a pawn up. So for sure he can be very happy, and I would say that only black can have realistic chances of winning the position, even though objectively it's something very close to a draw. So this is if bishop to h6. We could also look at bishop to g5, for example. Now, after bishop to g5, black should play the move bishop to f6. Otherwise, you know, if you step away with the queen, let's say, you may have to be very, very careful with f6 ideas in the future, and also with bishop h6 ideas, when there is no, you know, eventual queen to f6, as in the line we just examined. So bishop f6 is the natural move, and white can now play rook f1, bringing his final piece into play and defending. Bishop takes g5, rook takes g5, queen to f6, just to block off these ideas. And now white, in the game that we're looking at, a grandmaster game, white played the move bishop takes d5, and here the problem was that, and this game, by the way, was played between Bassem Amin, who is, I believe, one of the top Egyptian players, if I'm not mistaken, and then Alexander Aryshchenko, who I think is a strong Ukrainian grandmaster. I may be wrong about Aryshchenko, but anyway, this is, you know, white was 2650 plus, black 2700 plus, very high level game. But the thing is, in this position, after bishop takes d5, white kind of went wrong with the move e3. Black rather, he played e3, and then now after rook to g3, well, there were some serious problems defending this pawn. In fact, he pretty much gave up. He played the move bishop e6, and then bishop e4, and then he played a rook move, and you know, the pawn was just picked up by white. And it is difficult to defend this pawn once it kind of goes onto e3. But instead, here black could have just played the move rook to e8. And after this move, white has a much greater struggle to actually pick up this e pawn. And so I think that this position can be said to be approximate equality. And if anything, I would probably fancy black's chances a little bit better. I think if he plays accurately, white's pieces can be a little bit vulnerable as well to attack. White still has the back rank issues. The bishop can be vulnerable in certain lines. The queen side can also be vulnerable, and this pawn can be quite dangerous at the opportune moment. So yeah. So this is let's say how this is how black could play against the move bishop to g5. You play bishop to f6. You do surrender this d5 pawn. You don't push this one too much. You just bring the rook onto e8. And sooner or later, you're going to develop, and you're going to have black is going to have good chances within the position. So this crazy line, let's say, stemming from basically here. In this position, we were saying, well, white could play rook e1, but we're saying, what if white goes ahead and plays the move f4 and sacrifices a pawn? So we see that black should basically, if white plays f4, black should go ahead and capture the pawn, and after the exchange of knights, f5 gets played, and then e5, and then we see, you know, some tactical ideas with d5 push, bishop c5, taking advantage of this pin. We saw white bring his queen to h5 and taking advantage of the pressure on f7. We saw many different ideas here. Let's consider the other option, which is rook to e1. I think this plan is not really all that incisive or dangerous as lines with a quick f4 and f5, where, you know, if this happens as black, you need to know what you're doing. You need to play very precisely, otherwise you can get in a lot of trouble very quickly. Whereas with this, it's a little bit harder. Black has more time to complete his development, so that's what he goes ahead and does with bishop e7. Now f4, castle, e5, d takes e5, f takes e5, knight takes b3 is, yeah, I mean, I should say that in this position here, white, you know, once he commits his rook to e1, then f4, f5 ideas are a lot less strong, especially because while white was bringing his rook over to e1, black was developing his pieces. So it's you know, it's a bit of a kind of twofold issue, you know. On the one hand, the rook is not as effectively placed, and on the other, black is better prepared to deal with the threat. So instead, once the rook goes to e1, the general idea is to play f4. This time not to plan f5, but to push e5 and put this knight to a tricky decision, and also gain the e4 square from which white may be able to launch some kind of attack. But yeah, in general, you know, this attack along, say, the dark squares is a lot less dangerous for black in a Sicilian than an attack targeting the f-pawn. So f4 castle. Now e5, d takes e5, f takes e5. Now nice in between move, knight takes b3, a takes b3, and bishop to c5. Again, very common to try and take advantage of this. If e takes f6, then take here with check and then collect the f6 pawn. And so after bishop to c5, white has to react to that, play bishop to e3, and now knight d5. Very strong threat of knight takes d5, or knight takes e3, so white plays knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and now black is not only threatening to capture on e5, but also rook d8 may be uncomfortable. So white typically plays a move like knight to f3, and here this position has actually been reached a couple of times, and black has played in different ways, but I like the move bishop to e7, conserving the bishop pair. I think that because of white's extra space in this position and the fact that black has yet to develop, I think that even though black has the bishop pair, I don't really think he can claim much of an advantage. But I would say that he doesn't stand worse. I think that if white wants to draw from this position and he plays well, I think he can more or less force matters in that regard, some way or another. You know, I don't know, maybe bishop to g5 even already would maybe the game could end like bishop to g5, bishop c5 check, bishop to e3, bishop to e7. You know, and this might be a typical way that you see a grandmaster game end, where white realizes he hasn't really gotten much out of the opening. But if white is not careful, then you know, if black can finish his development, get his bishop onto a good square, then in the long run, black has a more compact pawn structure we see here versus this, which is not so great. So black's pawn structure is better, and long term he has the bishop pair, and this bishop, while for the time being is undeveloped, it actually has huge potential, because if it gets onto this c6 square, or even b5 and bishop to b7, if it gets onto this long diagonal, it's going to be a very strong piece. So yeah, we've seen that really this idea with rook to e1. Let's say, so what we were basically saying is that in this position, after the move knight to c5, f4 is, you know, pretty dangerous, and black needs to know what he's doing. Knight c takes e4, and know that after f5 you can confidently respond with this e5 idea, like so. And then to know that after queen h5 you have this d5 shot. Also you have queen to d7 we mentioned, but you have d5, and after rook e1 you have, you know, you cannot play e takes d4, but you have bishop to c5 and some craziness. Rook takes e4, castle, rook to g4, bishop takes d4 check, king to h1, and now e4. You know, and so you can certainly hang on here, and do more than hanging on. After rook h4 you have tactical shots like bishop takes f5. So, you know, white needs to know what he's doing, and if black needs to know what he's doing. If either side doesn't know what they're doing, they're probably going to get into trouble. If both sides know what they're doing, then it's probably going to be a draw. So that's certainly not bad. Not a bad result at all. So yeah, and then we saw that if instead of f4, white can go in a different direction with rook e1, which to be honest with you is probably what you're going to see more at the kind of club player level, under, say, even under 2200. You're probably going to see more of rook to e1, whereas at the let's say master level, you'll see more of f4 type ideas, because opponents are better prepared and more willing to give up a pawn in return for initiative. But rook e1 is not dangerous at all. You will simply continue your development and allow this f4 e5 plan, keeping in mind that this diagonal is weakened. Chop off the bishop on b3, strong piece. A takes b3, and now exploit this diagonal. And after bishop e3, knight d5, knight takes, queen takes d5, and like I said, you have the bishop pair and a more compact pawn structure. But on the other hand, your development hasn't finished yet, and this pawn on e5 does restrict you in terms of space. So all in all, more or less dynamically balanced position, and I think with good play it would end up in a draw. So this is okay. So in this position, after bishop to b3, knight bd7, we started off the video by saying that here f4 is the most common choice for white, the principal choice, but we wanted to look at castling and bishop g5 as alternatives first. So we've just looked at castling, so let's move on now to the second option for white, which is bishop to g5. Now with bishop to g5, well, we play very similarly. Knight to c5, again putting some pressure on e4, but mostly threatening to grab the bishop on b3. After the move f4, black can play bishop to e7 to stop any ideas of e5 with this nasty pin. White plays the move queen f3. This is a very natural setup for white to take, and you see this type of position as well in some lines of, one of the main lines against the Sicilian Najdorf, which is the immediate move bishop to g5 on move 6. So this is a little bit of a hybrid of that. Queen f3, now queen to c7, and the queen very often goes into this square, especially in situations where white is quite possibly going to castle queenside, because then, if white castles queenside, well, this rook is going to end up on d1 and will be x-raying the queen, and that's unpleasant, whereas the king is going to end up on c1. So from when the queen goes onto c7, well, it steps onto the c file and x-rays the king, so it leaves the square from which it would be getting x-rayed by white's rook, and goes on to a square from which it x-rays the white king. So that's certainly an improvement. But there's another detail as well, which is that after the move queen to c7, in some situations b5, e5 may rise, and in these positions it's nice to have the queen here to support a bishop to b7 response to the opening of this diagonal. So here we can look at two different options. Oh, sorry, 1 second, let me get the board back. Okay, here we are. Or are we? No, I don't think we are. Let me find the board. Okay. So white now has to continue his own development, and will typically choose to go for queenside castling, but on occasion white will castle kingside. So let's look at that one first. If white castles kingside, black can go ahead and do likewise. And here white has a couple of choices. One of them is just to play f5 here, trying to work open, this strong pawn wall, let's say, and that is shielding the black king from this bishop. So in this case, after f5, it's generally convenient to pick off the bishop on b3, and after a takes b3, simply bishop to d7. And to be honest with you, I mean, you could analyze this position for a much longer time if you wished, but I'm happy to stop it here, because black is on the verge of completing his development, and white doesn't really have any tremendously strong threats. He can maybe aim for some kind of slower attack. Slower attack at some point, and he does have, reasonably well placed pieces and a little bit of a space advantage. So I'm not saying that white is worse off by any means, but on the other hand, white has his certain vulnerabilities along this diagonal. Black has the bishop pair. Black has a very, let's say, compact pawn structure, and I think that it's a good position for him, and it's a little bit similar to other positions. So I would say that the opening phase has more or less concluded here, and it's just a maybe dynamically balanced middle game. So instead, let's consider the instead of the move f5, we can also consider here, what if white plays a move like rook ae1. Well, in this case, I would recommend to chop off on b3 once again. Knight takes b3 this time around. And here, play b5 to complete his development. And now we see this point that I was making earlier about having the queen on c7 can be useful, because if white now plays the move e5, black has the response bishop to b7. Now, I should say that white can go for a queen sacrifice here, playing the move e takes f6, and it has indeed been tried a few times in tournament practice, but not with much success, because I actually think that black's position is just better, frankly. F takes e7. Now, it would seem as though white is going to win 3 pieces for queen, and generally speaking, in the middle game, it's considered the 3 pieces for queen is advantageous in general for the person who has the 3 pieces. But here specifically, black has a very strong move, which is queen to b6 check. Now the point is that if white plays the move king to h1, then there's going to be bishop takes g2 with check, picking up an important pawn, this kind of messing up white's pawn structure. We see this. And then the point is that after a move like rook to e8, sooner or later black is going to play f6 and going to pick up the e7 pawn as well. And so black is going to have a lot of pawns, not that many open files, and white's pieces are going to end up in a squares like the bishop on h4 and the knights here. So far, not such great coordination. So overall, I would certainly fancy black's chances much more than white's. I would not recommend this for white at all, and I would be very, very happy if I was able to get this position as black. Of course, white doesn't have to go to h1. He can play the move rook to f2, but that doesn't really change matters too much, because after rook e8, white, now the point is of this idea is revealed, that either way white's pawn structure is going to get worse. This time around he has to take like this because the rook is being pinned, and now black can sooner or later play the move f6, bishop to h5, maybe throw in b4 in between. It depends, but eventually you're going to get a position like this, and basically the material tally is white has 3 minor pieces, but black has the queen and the pawn, and in and of itself that's that's approximately equal material balance. But when we look at the weaker pawn structure and the slightly more vulnerable white king, as well as the central pawn mass here, I think black's chances are significantly higher than white's. So after e5, the point is that black can play bishop to b7 with a clear conscience, knowing that he's not going to get into heaps of trouble if white decides to sacrifice his queen. So because of this, white will generally play against bishop to b7, queen to g3. This is actually not the only move that has been played. There was a game between a friend of mine, actually, Gawain Jones, the strong English grandmaster, and Emil Sutovsky, a very strong Israeli grandmaster. And this game was played in 2013, in Caleta 2013. And Gawain, with the white pieces, he played the move queen to e2. And black responded with knight to d5. And we actually see that, after bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, e takes d6, queen takes d6, rook to d1, queen to c7, a3, knight to f5, we can get an idea of the dangers for white that lie in store for white if he's ill prepared against this against the Najdorf and kind of chooses this line, because if you take stock in this position here, well, we can definitely say that two things. We can say that the battle of the minor pieces, let's say, has been won by black. We can say that the knight and the bishop are much better than these two knights. This bishop is a very, very powerful piece, crashing down onto the g2 square and potentially combining very effectively with the queen, the black queen. And then we can also look at the pawn structure, and we can say that white's pawn structure is a lot less harmonious than black's. Black's pawn structure is very compact, whereas white is probably around this point regretting that he has played f4, permanently weakening this diagonal, and also just having a weakening effect on the g2 square as well, because if your pawn was here, then at some point, if you really needed to patch up that diagonal, you could play the move f3. But with the pawn here, there are constant issues, and to me it's no surprise that Sutovsky did eventually manage to win this game. And actually I just realized that I was sort of tarnishing the name of my friend Gawain Jones, because I looked at the situation, and it turns out I believe that it was with white, certainly Jones, but not Gawain Jones, not G Jones, but instead R Jones, which would be Richard Jones, I believe, a Welsh player, if I'm not mistaken. But again, I may be tarnishing his name this time around. So just, all I'll say is that it was Sutovsky with the black pieces. This I know for sure. And a Mr. R Jones rated just under 2400 in 2013 Gibraltar event, I think. I think the Caleta is Gibraltar. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that black is doing very, very well here, and a move like queen e2 or a move like e takes f6 are already putting white in kind of an let's say not a very pleasant position. So instead of queen to e2, objectively I think the best try is this move on the board, queen to g3. And now the idea is that, well, there are some issues here against the black king, and black, actually, I really like this. This is a novelty. It hasn't been played. I think that in tournament games, when white has played queen to g3, knight to e8 has been the popular response. But I find that the knight on e8 is going to take a little bit of a while to get into the game, because let's say even if bishop takes and queen takes, something like this happens, well, sure, the black knight could step in like this, but if white leaves the tension like this, then for now, for the time being, black's knight doesn't have any jumps at all. And swapping off here, black swapping off will not, will not change that fact. So instead, I like this tactically, this move with a tactical basis, which is the move king to h8. And it seems as though black is just giving up a piece. But the point is that after e takes f6 and g takes f6, now the bishop is being attacked. And if the bishop steps away from g5 to either square, h4 or h6, the point is rook to g8 will hit the queen. And if the queen moves, well, g2 is going to be extremely vulnerable. I don't know exactly how the best continuation is, whether it's to grab immediately or whether it's to play queen c6 or whether it's to play rook g6 and then follow it up with the other rook. but I can tell you that this is definitely not good for white, not good for white. So you can do your further investigations, and we can consider this move to be good. And after king to h8, well, the point is that white may, strengthen the g2 pawn so that now e takes f6. E takes f6 really is a threat. But here's the kind of clever little idea about this move, is that it's vacated the g8 square, and the knight does actually take advantage of this, and now knight g8 is an option. Now if, say, bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, well, the knight is going to be climbing back into the game much more effectively. But if white maintains the tension, well, sooner or later black can exchange, and then he'll have the e7 square all the same. So it's kind of a crafty way of using tactics to solve this strategic problem. So here I think that black has no problems at all. I don't see white's attack as particularly threatening, and black has developed his pieces completely, and maybe is going to be able to get some kind of minority attack going against on the queen side, and also bring his rooks over to the open or semi-open files in the future. So this that we've been looking at is simply the short castling try, which, as we can see, is not a very threatening setup against setup in this particular variation, beginning with bishop g5 and then f4 and queen f3. This setup, much more threatening is and principled, would be to play queenside castling, so that can be considered the main line. Here again, black can simply continue with his general play. We see several different ideas. We can talk about black's setup in this position. It's usually to bring his bishop out. Eventually he's going to castle, but in the meantime he's going to place his queen on the c7 square, push his b pawn. He's already maneuvered the knight onto c5. He wants to get the bishop onto the long diagonal, and then maybe sooner or later he might even put a rook on c8. So he's just carrying on with his plan. After b5, bishop takes f6 is I believe the most common response. And here, it's weird because in my database, people have been taking back with the g-pawn pretty much all the time. But I simply don't see, maybe there's some brilliant refutation that my computer cannot pick up, but I have a reasonably strong engine analyzing it, and I tried to look at this, and I just don't understand why people are not capturing back with the bishop. So that's going to be my recommendation. Again, I will always say, when it comes to opening theory, especially with something as sharp as the Najdorf, nobody has all the answers in the Najdorf. I certainly don't. And I've lost some very, almost humiliating games and when I say almost, I lie. I've lost some truly humiliating games, in the Najdorf. As black, and actually that was one of the reasons why I stopped playing it competitively, because I felt that just the amount of theory when facing like strong grandmasters who play a lot of tournament games every year, the amount of theory and the amount of lines and traps that I just had to keep in my memory, as somebody who was only playing maybe 1 or 2 FIDE rated events per year, even when I was active, I just couldn't keep up with the pace of Najdorf theory and the demands of Najdorf theory at that kind of a level. So, as I say, I mean, this kind of this whole point that I'm making is just that, I hope that you really get something out of this as a viewer, and you expand not just your knowledge of theory, but your knowledge of ideas and plans and themes within the Najdorf. And I do think that you'll be well served by going over this material. But certainly there may be, I cannot claim that everything that I say is is gospel, shall we say that, because I simply don't have all the answers myself. So after bishop takes f6, I mean, the only thing that I can think of as to why it may be dangerous is because of this idea of knight to f5. Kind of a typical sacrifice. And then if e takes f5, well, on the one hand, the d5 square is available. On the other, there may be some e5 ideas, and the e file has been opened, etc. So there is a concern there. But I just think after knight takes b3 check, a takes b3, if you run the gauntlet and you take the knight on f5, knight goes to d5. Now you play the move queen to d7, a kind of a smart move, going to a bit of an unusual square because it allows knight b6 ideas, but you have to keep in mind that black has won a piece. So after a move like knight b6, queen to b7, let's say knight takes, well, maybe f takes e4, and then next move queen takes a8, or maybe queen takes a8 immediately. But the point is that if black can end up with the bishop pair against one rook and be prepared to castle next move, then he can be very, very happy with himself. So that would be a big mistake on white's part. Instead, a move like after queen d7, rook h e1, and here in this particular position, what am I recommending? Yeah, bishop to b7, and so you might ask yourself, well, why not simply castling? Well, castling itself wouldn't be, a huge disaster or anything, but it would give up any claim to an advantage, because here white could just force a draw. Knight takes f6 check, g takes f6, and we see that the black king is very much exposed. White plays the move e5, threatening to capture on a8, also threatening rook takes d6. Bishop to b7 is the only response. Now queen g3 check, king to h8 only move, and now queen to h4. And we see that combined with these double attacks, black's best bet is to simply capture on e5, and after queen f6 check, king g8, queen g5 check, king h6, we see that it's going to be a draw by perpetual. So that's the maybe not so obvious reason why after the move rook h e1, black just bravely stays in the middle of the board and plays the move bishop to b7. Now after e takes f5 with a discovered check, the point, or at least one of the points behind the move queen to d7 instead of a square like d8 is revealed. Black actually goes to d8 and takes shelter in this square, which is not such a bad square because white doesn't have any dark squared bishop, so there's no, crazy crushing bishop a5 check type moves coming in anytime soon. And as for the white knight, well, the king on d8 is not so badly placed. It's much better on d8 than if it was, let's say, on d7, where it would be one move away from being checked. But on d8 it's relatively safe. And of course black's extra piece is a dark squared bishop here, so black can hang on along the dark squares rather well, especially, for example, if white plays a move like queen f2 to try and attack along the dark squares. Well, bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, and now the move king to c7. And we see what I was saying about the extra piece being the dark squared bishop, and to me this position just doesn't look like white has anything too close to compensation here. So certainly I would be very happy to play bishop takes f6, the natural move, instead of g takes f6. And if after bishop takes f6 white wants to play a move like knight f5, then be my guest. And if he wants to play a move like e5, well, you always have this bishop b7 intermezzo move, and then capture on e5. And I just don't see any real good reason why black should in this position here capture on f6, and then where is your king going to go to long term? For me, if I'm going to capture like this, I want to be given a very good reason as to why I need to spoil my pawn structure. So that's the castling line. The short castling and the queenside castling as two options. And that basically draws the first part of this variation, which is the move bishop to g5 here in this position. Bishop to g5. Sorry, not in this position. E6. E6, bishop to b3. This is the main line. Knight bd7, and what we were saying is f4 would be the main line in this, but we were just looking at this idea of not castle, but the idea of bishop to g5. And yeah, we also looked at earlier, we looked at castling and this either f4 or rook e1. The last thing that we looked at was bishop to g5, and then again knight c5, and again f4, although this time around you cannot capture because of this pin. So we've basically looked at the bishop g5 line here and also the castling line, and they're the two main alternatives to the main line of the bishop b3, and that is the move f4. So let's cover this line. This is the last thing that we need to look at, and I don't think that this is overly threatening actually. Black can now play the move knight to c5, and I just want to point out that if white castles here, well, after knight c takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, f5, e5, queen h5, you know, the more observant viewers amongst you will maybe be thinking, well, this looks very similar to a line that we previously covered, and sure enough, it is simply a transposition. This particular position is a transposition to the line covered by the move order of on the 8th move, castle first. So this, we don't need to look at that as an option. In other words, here in this position, we do not need to consider castle as an independent option, because you simply grab the pawn and you transpose into the same move order, but into the same position that we had already looked at via the move order of 8 castle. So what else? If not castle, then, well, in this position we have a couple of other options. The main option is f5 here, and that's probably the most incisive one. Let's consider the move queen to f3. If queen to f3, well, now we have b5, and we see something similar, only the bishop is not, to the previous line that we looked at, only the bishop is not on g5. After b5, white can play the move f5. Black responds thematically with e5, knight to c6, queen to d7. And this may seem like a bit of a silly jump if it's now going to have to push back, but the point is it pushes to b4 so that white uses this strong outpost d5, but black is okay with that because he also has some nice black squared control, so he plays the move bishop to b7. Now a very important point is that if the move bishop to d5 here, you actually have a crazy tactical shot, which is knight c takes e4, and the point is that if knight takes e4 like this, well, now you can recapture your piece, and if bishop takes e4, well, then in this case you can play knight takes e4, and d5, and you're hitting both knights. So that's a nice tactical idea which a lot of players may fall for. So instead white plays the move knight bd5, but in fact you still have knight takes e4 as a tactical shot. Now the point again is if knight takes e4, then you have knight takes d5 and you're up a pawn. But this time around, because it was a knight that jumped onto the d5 square, well, there is knight to b6. But the point is that now black has to move knight takes c3, hitting the queen. So queen takes c3 is the only option. And now queen takes f5. And now if knight takes a8, bishop takes a8, And in my opinion, this is good for black. I mean, this is 2 pawns, 2 central pawns, and an exchange for the rook. That is very, very good material, especially because you know, we can say that this bishop is a very strong piece, already crashing down on g2, and white's king is in the center. Having said that, black has not completed his own development, and his position is maybe a little bit more loose than he'd like, you know. But I think that, you know, if white's king was extremely safe, then I think that white would have a lot of chances, because this is a strong bishop. The black king is still not castled. It's still at least 2 moves away from being able from being castled. And the queen on f5 is a little bit exposed. As I said, the pawn on b5 is a bit exposed. The bishop on a8 is a little bit loose. Of course, the queen is covering this square, but if it wasn't, then, you know, already there would be some issues. So I would say white maybe has good chances, would have good chances, were it not for the fact that white also has some problems. So I think overall this position favors black, if anything. So where did this all come from? It came from the move of queen to f3. In this position, we were saying that f5 is the most common continuation, but we were just looking at queen f3 and the way that black would respond to that, with b5, and then after f5, e5, and then after knight c6, knight b4 maneuver. Well, black has some tactical shots against e4. Then we said that if castle, well, in this case, knight c takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, f5. e5 is just a transposition to a line that we've already looked at. So what else can white do if not queen f3 or if not castle? We've said the main line is f5. The only other alternative here is the move e5. But as I said to you earlier on in this video, in general, this idea is not so incisive. Black can defend much better along the dark squares. So here, probably the most accurate defense is the move knight f d7, just because d takes e5, f takes e5 will open up some lines. Again, not a huge disaster, but I think knight f d7, I just like it that a little bit more. Now, e takes d6. After e takes d6, black actually has a very kind of clever move, which is just to return to f6. And we see that this pawn is going to be a little bit out of place now that the e pawn is gone. And once black can play bishop takes d6, at any point he can snatch the bishop on b3. And I think we can say that black's position is very, very comfortable here. For example, the game might continue bishop to e3, bishop takes d6, queen to f3, something like this. Castle short. Now, if white castles short, I think there's no real risk for black. Better to castle long. Queen to c7, step out of the way, and get x-ray the white king. And yeah, and in my opinion here, black has a good game. Sooner or later, he's going to be able to push b5, launch a bit of an attack on the queen side. At any given moment, he can chop off on b3, and yeah, to me this position is just very solid, and the opening phase of the game is almost finished. So yeah, so this is sorry, so let's go right back. This came from this idea of e5 on the 9th move. So that's pretty much it in terms of alternatives to the main line, right? We've looked at e5 just now, queen to f3, castling as a transposition. So let's continue with the main line, which is f5. Now, after the move f5, black actually has had great results with the move bishop to d7, but it's something that you guys can kind of look at in your own time if that's what you wish. For now, I'm going to just look at the main line because I think it's sufficient. Bishop to e7. White now plays queen f3, and we see, you know, as I said, this is the the main idea behind this opening is to first bring your bishop onto the a2 g8 diagonal and then push the f pawn forward to try and pressure the black position. Black, however, has played this, which is a great maneuver, because from here the knight not only supports the e6 pawn but also threatens to chop off on b3 at the right moment if needs be, and also puts pressure on the e4 pawn. So after castle here, we could say black castles, and now white could castle. If he castles, black can just play the move e5 here, push the knight back to e2, and now b5. And I would say this is just similar play to other lines, but an important point is that black is comfortable here since there's no crazy attack on the f pawn, and because black already has his knight on c5, if the pressure ever gets too much against this particular pawn, which won't happen anytime soon, but if it does, then knight takes b3 can always kind of alleviate that pressure. And in the meantime, black is going to have a lot of play against the center, a lot of pressure against the center, and even b4 may come into play. So white has his own issues to kind of worry about. And also this diagonal is exposed because of the f pawn push, so in some situations black can try to make the most of that as well. So so I don't think we have to fear short castle here too much. Let's continue with the main way to play, which would be a move like bishop to e3 here, allowing for the possibility of castling queenside for a stronger, a sharper attack. Now after bishop to e3, here e5 is actually the main line, but there's nothing wrong with e5 per se, but I'm just simply going to recommend the move queen to c7, because I think that e5 isn't going away anytime soon, and the move queen to c7 is just that little bit more flexible to my mind. So how can black continue here? Well, or how can white continue here? Well, one option is castle, but after castle I think that this is a really nice way to play. b5, f takes e6, f takes e6, right? Trying to bust open the position a little bit, but black is doing fine. And now white wants to put more pressure on this point, so he plays the move queen to h3. And here I just like this novelty, the move d5. And the point is that black is going to be opening up the position, right? After, say, he takes d5, something like this. Black will be opening up the position, but, sorry, if he takes d5, he probably has to capture on b3 first. Otherwise, there's going to be some, crazy knight takes d5 against the king. But let's say, we have a situation like this. Of course, the white queen is under attack, so the white queen will have to move. And the point is that black has opened up the position. Sure, this pawn is vulnerable because it's an isolated pawn, but it's also a central pawn, and so it will support some, knight to e4s or anything like that in the future. And the point is that black has the bishop pair here, and in general, the bishop pair will thrive in an open position. So I just think that black is doing well here, and the weaker pawn structure is more than compensated. So that's how I would respond to this line, beginning with the move 12 castle. But if white doesn't castle, if white doesn't go for a short castle, then maybe a more logical or more consistent way to play it would be to play the move g4 and launch the attack, knowing that the white king can always migrate to the queen side. So after g4, black plays b5, again the same thing that we've seen many times before, bishop onto b7, and also some attack, and also of course if the king is going to land on c1, then that's going to be a good move. And now white can continue with the move g5, but white apparently has launched this attack very quickly. But I like that we're kind of ending this video series on this line. If anybody has been disciplined enough to work their way through this two-part series, rather long two-part series, then here we're able to look at a particular idea that I think is very useful to have in mind, which is because it surfaces from time to time. And this is knight takes e4. In situations where b5 has been played and the queen is along this diagonal, when white then pushes the g pawn, we see this situation where the queen and the rook are vulnerable, and so the black bishop can exploit this tactically. And knight takes e4, and the point is, after knight takes e4, now very careful, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, bishop b7 would be great for black, but unfortunately after knight takes e4, black's king is in a little bit of trouble, and the move f6 is actually a real problem. So there's no need to capture the piece, because after all, white isn't down a piece, so he doesn't need to capture the knight to restore material equality or material parity, and so he can just go after the king, and this is actually very, very serious. So this needs to be avoided, but instead the move bishop to b7 is very strong, because now the threat is to recapture the knight, but capture it with the bishop, and then hit not only the queen but hit the rook behind it as well. So after bishop b7, f takes e6 is the way forward. And here, if f takes e6 again, then queen h3 would actually be pretty devastating. Here, you know, it would be very difficult for black to capture the knight in a good situation, because knight takes e6 is coming, and it's going to unleash this bishop on b3, and then the queen as well. It's really very many problems. I wish that I could kind of explain move by move what actually is going on in these situations, but you can either throw them into your computer or investigate them by yourself to know exactly why. Otherwise, you know, these videos would just become 5 hours long, and you know, nobody has five spare hours to look at the bishop c4 line in the Sicilian Najdorf. So yeah, so where are we? F takes e6, yeah, bishop takes e4 instead. E takes f7 check, king to h8. Okay, so we're seeing some pretty crazy position here, and now white actually plays the move queen to h5. And the reason why I really am glad that we're ending it on this kind of this line, looking at this position, is because I think it's a good tribute to, you know, the spirit of this bishop c4 line, and also the resources that black has at his disposal. Here, black could grab the rook, and he would in fact be up a full rook, but he would be forced to resign after the move g6. You know, crafting a deadly net around the black king. h6 would be the only option, but after the move bishop takes h6, white would be breaking through decisively, and and there's no way for black to solve his problems. Even, you know, it's funny, but I was thinking a move like bishop f3, right, hoping for queen takes f3, and then you could recapture on h6. Of course, you might say this move doesn't work because I can just capture the bishop on f3. But I'm thinking there may be an even stronger move here. I mean, of course, this is sufficient, but I'm thinking knight to f5 may be a very pretty way of finishing things off, because you're putting more pressure on g7, and it turns out you don't need the queen in order to checkmate the king. If bishop takes queen, then bishop takes g7 is checkmate, as the remaining squares are covered by the pawns. And yeah, and there's no way around it, because let's say that you defend the g7 point, bishop takes g7 is still checkmate. And the reason for this is because if you haven't taken the queen, then there's a double check. So this is like a double checkmate, although of course it only counts for one win, unfortunately. Well, actually probably fortunately, because this is a repertoire for black mainly. So anyway, silliness to one side, queen h5, black goes for the move bishop to g6 instead. And now, white can play queen f3. And here, there is, you know, a couple of ways in which black can play. One is knight takes b3, a takes b3, and simply bishop takes f7. Say queen to g2 to step out of this, and queen to d7, something like this. And then we look at the position and we say, well, material is equal, but the position is quite open. Black's king is actually, if anything, safer than white's king, and black has the bishop pair. So I really like this position for black. I think that it is comfortable little edge, and I fancy black's chances much more than I do white's. For example, d5, bishop to g6, bishop to e4 maybe coming next, and it's hard to see really where exactly white's king is going to end up. Maybe, just maybe, he can castle right now short and be more or less okay, but with no pawns covering this diagonal and this strong light square bishop potentially going to be stepping into a square, a very central square like e4, then I would say, you know, black has the better of the chances for sure. But I also want to cover one alternative, and that is in this position, instead of knight takes b3, black could also play the move bishop takes g5, which may seem a little bit strange. But the point is that we saw in the previous line this g6, devastating g6 mating net. So instead, black has now given up a bishop, but now plans on playing the move bishop to e4, hitting the queen. Now, the best move in this position is actually the rather strange looking knight to e6 counter shot. Perhaps in this position, let's say the typical player would play the move queen f1, trying to hang on to the rook. But here, after knight takes b3, a takes b3, and rook takes f7, well, black would have to play a move like queen to g1. But here, I really don't think, or white rather, would have to play a move like queen to g1. But yeah, after bishop takes h1, queen takes h1, rook e8 check, we see that in terms of material, white has two pieces in exchange for rook and pawn. So we can say that material is roughly equal. But the problem is that white's king is extremely vulnerable, and all of white's pieces are either a little bit out of the game, like this rook, or a little bit loose and vulnerable, like the knight and the bishop, and even the queen and the rook. Well, we see that these two rooks are extremely strong indeed. So the move here, queen to c5, is hitting both pieces. The game could continue with a move like queen to g1, but now black can simply play the calm move like queen d5. And really, I think that white is going to have to pray a little bit to not lose this in the next 5 or 6 moves. And I really do think that white's position is very, very close to losing, if not lost. Simply because it's going to be very hard for him to finish his development and you know, bring harmony into his position in time. So that would be a mistake. So instead of queen to f1, white's best bet is to play the move knight to e6, and the point being that if bishop takes f3, well, knight takes c7 is coming in. And so after knight to e6, black's best bet is to play knight takes e6. Now queen takes bishop. You see the reason behind this knight e6 move is to deflect the knight away from the defense of the bishop on e4. But after queen takes e4, black has the move knight takes g5, recovering the piece, and queen e2, now capturing the dangerous pawn on f7. White can castle, and now black can play the move knight to e5. Now, whether or not this is better than the previous line, than what I looked at earlier of just chopping off on b3, I don't necessarily think that this is better. Perhaps chopping off on b3, I can look at that just one more time quickly and show that position in a second, is perhaps better. But here we can say, you know, black is up a pawn, has a reasonably placed knight. This is a bit vulnerable, and the black king is a little bit vulnerable as well. But overall, I would say that this position is maybe fractionally better for black, but not too much, because basically black is up a pawn, and I would say that the pawn is maybe 70 or 80% compensated by the fact that black's position is structurally a little bit loose. His king is slightly vulnerable, and you know, and white has certainly a strong bishop on b3. So yeah, in fact, really, the more I look at this, the more that I'm inclined to recommend, instead of getting into this kind of craziness, to recommend the other line. Let's see, where are we? One second. Yeah, so I've just placed the position on the board that I'm referring to, and here what we were saying is that black can play the piece sacrifice, bishop takes g5, then bishop takes g5, and then bishop e4, then go after the rook on h1, and we saw the queen f1 would be bad for white, and yeah, so he could go bishop takes g5, bishop takes g5, bishop e4, and here in this position, black would play the move, white would play the move knight e6, deflecting the queen, then knight takes e6, and after queen takes e4, we have knight takes g5 and knight takes f7, and then knight to e5. This is the line that we just looked at. Black merges a pawn up, but you know, white has some trumps in the position, and so it's approximate equality. But the simpler, and I think the more I look at it, nicer option is to play knight takes b3, and here white can simply recapture a takes b3. Now pick up the pawn on f7. White steps out of the way with queen g2, and now simply get onto a good square, queen d7, onto the light squares. You have some very good light squared dominance, shall we say. So yeah, so of course this would be you know, a major major opening success for black if he could arrive at this kind of a position. So where did all of that come from? Well, we were investigating this line with a quick g4, and in the main line, where basically white drops his bishop back to b3, black reacts with this fast knight d7 to c5 idea. White keeps pushes the f pawn quickly, supports it with the queen, tries to get play along this diagonal. Black, on the other hand, positions his pieces, you know, places his pieces well, puts a lot of central pressure with the bishop on b7, the knights on c5 and f6, all crashing down on the e4 pawn. Sometimes we see that there are some tactical shots available to black as a result of that. And also at an opportune moment, black will capture the bishop on b3. And in general, black, in terms of his king's safety and his own development, will just bring the bishop out to e7, castle short, and grit his teeth against the white assault. And in general, if black plays well, he can neutralize the white attack quite well. If white does, of course, once white has pushed f4, he's weakened this diagonal, and his own king may have some problems. And we've seen in some variations, black has moves like bishop to c5 with the king on g1, the knight on d4, pinning the pinning one of white's pieces. So white definitely has to take into account the weaknesses he creates in his own camp as he's launching the f pawn forward. And we saw just now that launching the g pawn forward is not without its risks as well. That, especially when the queen is on f3, that actually exposes the rook on h1, and we saw several ideas centered around trying to win this rook, or you know, capturing on e4 with the bishop and winning a lot of material in this way. So that basically concludes the bishop c4 line. I think it's been, you know, I asked if the previous bishop e2 video was long, and if that one wasn't long, then this one certainly I think is. Unfortunately, there's just so much to cover that if you want to maintain a kind of a certain comprehensiveness, then it's very difficult to make the videos too much shorter than what I have. Again, I wouldn't worry too much if you find it overwhelming, the amount of lines. I think that most people aren't going to be, and I include myself, aren't going to be able to commit all of these different move orders and precise ideas to memory. But I think that the important thing is to be familiar with the different plans and see them cropping up time and time again. And hopefully in your games, if you don't remember the specific move order, then at least you'll remember the main way to bring out your pieces and the main kind of weak spots in your own in black's position as well as in white's position, and the main ways to react against different ideas like f4, f5, or the offering of the pawn on e4, or when it's a good idea to capture the bishop, or pawn pushing, when to bring the pawn, when to leave the pawn on b5, when to take it onto b4 so that it harasses the knight on c3, etc., etc. So yeah, that's it from me for this second part of the Fischer-Sozin variation. Next video, I'm not quite sure which particular line I will be covering, but there's another, I guess, between 4 and 5 videos probably left in this rather comprehensive, rather detailed Najdorf series. So I hope that even if it might be a little bit too much, I hope that you've gotten something out of it, and I will be back soon. Please don't forget to like the video, and yeah, and of course if you're not yet subscribed to my channel and you like this type of content, then please do subscribe. Until next time.